Okay, so this will serve as a review of final exam concepts that will be on Professor Lorenzo and Professor Janellis's exams, since Professor Lang's have already taken their exams. So as a general overview, these are both going to be cumulative exams where most of the questions will be focused on the new content from chapters 20 through 22. However, there will still be questions from select topics of chapters 10 through 19 too, so make sure not to neglect studying those, and especially if you have access to your past midterms from those chapters, please go through and see what you got wrong on those previous midterms and make sure that you are able to solve them for these future exams, because there is always a chance that those topics will come up again. So I will be reviewing chapters 20 through 22 on the final exam review session on May 8th from 12 to 1 p.m. With additional time we have left over after those 3 chapters, I can take questions relating to the other chapters, or you can come to the class tutoring sessions this week with specific questions as well. Some advice for preparing for these exams: 1, review the professor's slides, of course, but better yet, create a study guide of your own. That way you are able to understand and process the content and be able to create something that's digestible for you and that helps you study better. As well, please make sure that you are completing practice questions if your professor put them up on either MindTap or if they made a study guide of their own. Those practice questions are really helpful for, even if the problems on the exam aren't quite the same, it's very helpful for pinpointing what topics you do and don't already understand. And then you know what to focus your studying efforts on. If you have questions, reach out to your TA or professor, or come to class tutoring sessions this week. So, from the new chapter, some of the concepts that are covered. In chapter 20, the main focus was on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So, with relation to aggregate demand, have an understanding of the wealth, interest rate, and exchange rate effects with aggregate supply. Make sure to understand concepts like sticky prices, sticky wages, and other misperceptions like that that affect aggregate supply. There is also long run equilibrium versus short run equilibrium. And then aggregate demand and aggregate supply shocks, equilibrium, and their different equilibriums and how the graphs look. From chapter 21, the concepts related to monetary policy and fiscal policy in relation to aggregate demand. It also covered the theory of liquidity, the multiplier effect, the crowding out effect, and stabilization policy. From chapter 22, have an understanding of the Phillips curve, both in the short and the long run, and how different factors can affect where the Phillips curve moves, and then have an understanding of aggregate supply shocks in relation to the Phillips curve, and then sacrifice ratio, rational expectations, and disinflation. Just as a disclaimer, these are also taken from one of the professor's own final exam review PowerPoints. So these are the concepts that the professor had mentioned that they will be covering. So from some old chapters, concepts you should be familiar with: GDP, have an understanding of the idea that expenditure equals income equals production, and then the equation for GDP, y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. Know the difference between real and nominal GDP, and also understand the difference between real and nominal as general terms, and then what GDP does and does not measure. From chapter 11, the main focus here was CPI, Consumer Price Index, and how CPI is calculated and how CPI can be used to compare prices and inflation across time. Chapter 12 related to productivity. So it was all about the production function, returns to capital, and then growth in relation to productivity. Chapter 13 was all about the financial system and institutions. So this was where we learned about national saving, public saving, private saving. If you came to the class sessions, we also showed the proof of why saving equals investments in a closed economy. This was also the loanable funds market graph, which plotted interest rate against loanable funds and how different factors can affect the movement along that graph. This was also a chapter related to investing versus saving, and then government deficits and debt. Chapter 14 was about the time value of money. So this was the equation about how the future value equals the present value times 1 plus r to the power of n years. This was also related to compounding, the rule of 70, which is the time it takes for something to double. Risk aversion, different insurance markets and adverse selection of moral hazard, firm versus market risk, knowing that firm risk can be diversified away, whereas market risk cannot, and then higher risk relates to higher return, and so on and so forth. Chapter 15 related to employment. So know the difference between what it means to be, for instance, unemployed versus not in the labor force is really important. Unemployment rate as well. Know that unemployment rate is the fraction of people who are unemployed divided by people in the labor force, which is just employed plus unemployed. It does not include the people not in the labor force. Know the differences between the different types of unemployment, cyclical, natural, but especially between frictional and structural, where structural is long-term and frictional is short-term. And then understand what happens when the market wage is set to be higher than the equilibrium wage, which actually is what creates structural unemployment. Chapter 16 was all about money and the Fed. This was all the fractional reserve banking problems where we had assets plotted against liabilities. And this was leverage ratio, reserve ratio, money multiplier. So know how to calculate all of those in case you see questions like that come up. Chapter 17 was about the quantity theory of money and the value of money versus the price level. So this all relates back to inflation. This was also the concept of classical dichotomy, which is just real versus nominal, and money neutrality. And then this also related to the Fisher effect and other concepts, again, with relation to inflation. Chapter 18 covered closed versus open economy, and this was the chapter that introduced net exports, how they equal net capital outflow. Understand that we talked earlier how saving equals investment in a closed economy. In an open economy, savings equals investment plus net exports. And since net exports is net capital outflow, you can also say like S equals I plus NCO. This was also where we saw graphs that plotted nominal and real exchange rates against net exports and net capital outflow. So have an understanding of the movements of those graphs. And this was also the law of one price and purchasing power parity. And then finally, chapter 19 was about loanable funds market in an open economy. And again, this also was working with some graphs and this time plotting real interest rates against net capital outflow. This was also problems related to exchange of foreign currency. And in this chapter, we learned about the twin deficits, which is the budget deficit and the trade deficit, and the way that they move together, and trade restrictions like tariffs and import quotas, how they impact our economy and our trade balance and our industries. So that's a general overview of everything that's covered. Again, the most important part is please try to focus on these chapters the most, but if there were concepts in old chapters that you didn't understand, make sure you have them down for this exam in case they do come up again. And again, to prepare, review past exams, review past practice problem, look at new practice problems related to the new chapters, and most of all, if you have a question, do not hesitate to ask your TA or your professor. They will be the best source, and they were very much more than happy to help answer any questions you might have.